Welcome to Voices of the Surplus Army, a side project of the Autonomia podcast. In this project, I hope to bring voices from the houseless community to you in hopes of breaking the artificial barrier between the housed and the unhoused. For most of us, if just a few things went wrong, we too could end up in the streets. Our only way forward is solidarity across the entirety of the working class, regardless of whether we have a roof over our heads or not. The intro and outro music comes to us from Pat the Bunny, and the song is called "The Hand You Reach Out Is Empty, As Is Mine." Thank you for listening. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for tuning back in. It's been a couple months, and I've had a few things I've been meaning to record and to speak about, and I have a couple projects in the works, but something came up recently that really gave me a bit of a kick in the face as far as getting something out there. And literally like a day later, something came up that only further underscored the need to get some perspectives out there on this. So apparently in Connecticut, they are currently trying to create a situation where some churches can have tiny homes on their property for the needy. You know, doing the whole Christ thing, doing the whole taking care of the needy, doing the least of these is what you do for me, that whole thing. And a lot of people are getting upset about the legal implications of it, or that it's somehow ugly or making the community bad. And it's frustrating because in theory, a church is a place for a community. It's a place to help the community, both from their perspective in a spiritual sense, but often in a much more tangible physical sense as well. Ever since churches have been around, they have usually been a place that has at least some amount of public-facing aid work. And of course, that's not just Christian churches. There are many synagogues that have outreach programs to help people out. There are a lot of mosques that do that. Charity is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. There's lots of places that do this, religious institutions. But for whatever reason in Connecticut, there's a church where this is happening, and it's becoming a debate. And a lot of people are taking the perspective that I would take, which is to not care about what the law thinks and just help people. Because if the law prevents you from helping people, the law has failed, and it is not only your option from my perspective, but your duty to break that law. There's the old saying of when tyranny becomes law, resistance becomes duty. And I firmly believe that, whether or not you want to view that perspective within the lens of the American project, it's just a true thing. And so on the radio show that I very frequently listen to and often participate in, one of the frequent guests, who's a friend of mine I would consider overall, I guess we found an area where we disagree. And he was kind of wrestling with this too, because he is a Christian man and was sort of trying to grapple with the conflict of law and order, as many conservatives seem to fixate on, and the Christian values of trying to help people. And this really brings up a lot of hard feelings for me. So you folks who have been listening to me for a while may remember the Tent City 2 fight. This is a fight where I was a participant in the early stages of COVID, where a camp was set up and was under threat of eviction. And it was called Tent City 2, or TC2. The 2, obviously, implies that there was a Tent City 1. This was also in the same area, and it was under a bridge at the time. And there was a sexual assault in Tent City 1, and while the victim was still in the hospital, police came and destroyed the entire camp. So this person that was already a victim of what we consider to be one of the worst things that can happen in mainstream society outside of a war zone, this person was victim of that and then was further victimized by the system that was supposedly protecting them by destroying all of their things. A lot of refugees from Tent City 1 ended up in Tent City 2, which was in the woods behind a local bank. And eventually, the authorities started to say this place needs to be removed. And I was involved with some projects at this place, helping with their infrastructure, helping with trash removal, and also building tiny houses for the people that were there. These were made out of pallets and plywood scrap left over from my job as a construction worker. And the whole theory was these are structures that are far stronger than tents. We saw COVID starting to happen. We saw the looming eviction crisis starting to happen and said, we are going into winter in a respiratory pandemic that at the time we knew almost nothing about. The shelters are going to be full, and people are not going to want to be cramped in with each other when everyone's coughing. The shelters are often overloaded in what we consider to be good times. So in bad times, things could be infinitely worse. And for a while, we built a lot of defensive infrastructure around this facility. It ended up getting rather tense with the local city government, and we, at the day before the final eviction, were in negotiations with the local police department. And they said they were committed to a peaceful resolution. And this is something they said to me personally. They were committed to a peaceful resolution. And I said, we are too, but we are willing to defend the space that you are considering attacking for the greater public good. We're not asking you to permit anything. We're not asking you to shoulder the difficulty of dealing with this problem. The system has failed, and we as people are standing up to fill that gap. All we are asking is that you stand out of the way. We recognize your reasoning. You recognize, presumably, our reasoning, and neither of us accept the other's reasoning as the right choice. And so we will both do what we think is right. And we believed that they were committed to a peaceful resolution. So, on a day that everyone was out, doing their jobs, the police showed up with contractors armed with chainsaws. And so under armed guard, these houses were cut apart with chainsaws. And the people that called that place home were deprived of their place to be, and their items were thrown away. We have built tiny houses for these people since then, but what we were pleading with them to understand is this Tent City 2 is a place where people can congregate in the open. A place where services can work with people. But the government said that's not safe. Not safe for them either. So now people have to hide. These tiny houses are built in secret, in the woods, far away from the eyes of the government that is supposed to care about them, in secret from the shelter services that always collude with the police and blow people's cover. The situation was made more dangerous, and our intervention was harm reduction from the sober acknowledgement that people will live in tents. Even if everything is going well, there are always people that, for whatever reason, cannot go to the shelter system. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And those people will invariably end up in tents. And those tents can collapse in the snow. Those tents can be cut by a falling branch. A big enough falling branch could kill the occupant. Those tents, if, for example, there's a candle in them and a branch falls on it, could start a fire, and that fire could get very bad. Those tents can flood very easily in the event of torrential downpour. The pallet houses, by contrast, I can jump on the roof of, and they can be built in one night for about $300. That money was often privately funded, and the materials for it were more often than not scavenged for free, meaning that they could usually be done for under $200. But the government said no because it was outside of their approved metric of solving things, even if their approved metric of solving things doesn't solve the problem. They care more about order and doing things their way than they do about actually addressing the problem. So fast forward to this issue in Connecticut. This church is being told they can't do that, and there's a legal grounds for it. But this church, presumably, is private property, so they're bending the rules a bit, and of course there are zoning laws. But how far into a crisis do you have to get to understand that the law, in some cases, is detrimental to resolving that crisis? Seriously, people going and helping each other, what is the problem there? In a related note, I was looking on a local Facebook group, just scrolling through looking for projects, and I saw someone asking if it was legal to park a camper in their friend's driveway to stay for a little bit while they were looking for a new place to live. And I learned that at least in that town, you can only have a camper in a driveway if it is unoccupied. Meaning that on your property, you cannot have a structure that is literally designed to live in your driveway, on your own private property. And this is where we get into the disingenuousness, or perhaps just the sheer ignorance of most conservatives, when they say, oh, if you want to help people, just put a few tents in your driveway. You can't. Oh, if you want to shelter some people, just put a camper or a trailer in your driveway. You can't. In many cases, you literally can't. If you wanted to try to help people in that way, you are not allowed to do it. And people with guns will come and stop you from helping your neighbor. To make things worse, we have an instance in New London, which is where a lot of my activism happens, where these people have bought a house, but it's not quite ready to move into yet. As far as I understand it, there were some contractors there. They're camping in a tent in their own front yard on property that they own. And they are told by city government through the police they need to vacate by 7 a.m. the next morning, or their stuff will be confiscated and they will be arrested. This is what we've let America become. This is what happens when the logic of the state goes insane. It hurts people. It's ridiculous. And it prevents us from being able to live and help our neighbors live. And to make things so much worse, a representative from the local homeless shelter apparently came to these people and said, oh, well, there's an encampment behind the bank that you could go to, as we're using it as an overflow at the moment. Yeah, did you catch that? That encampment behind the bank is the former location of Tent City 2, now reoccupied by homeless people because the problem still isn't solved. And you know what? Those homeless people are back in tents. And now the city government tells people, go camp over there in the place that we just paid people to shred all those homes that were built with chainsaws. This is government. This is evil. And this is the everyday reality that people live in. And then my favorite radio host, a guy who, honestly, anger aside, I consider a friend. I like a lot of what he has to say, and I give him a ton of credit for letting opposing views come on. But inevitably, there are times where people disagree. And he was talking about how in New Haven, in this particular case, another city in Connecticut, people were laying on the side of the road. People were homeless. People were panhandling. People were begging. And he said, what are we doing with all these folks all over the place? Well, we need to clean up the streets. We need to get rid of these people or criminalize this behavior. And I was pulling my hair out hearing this. He's calling it this criminal element. Criminalizing poverty and further criminalizing poverty is not going to save us. Rounding up the people that are panhandling is not going to give them the money that they're panhandling for. If you make poverty a crime and you clean up the streets, you're not creating prosperity. You're creating the illusion of prosperity by sweeping proof of that illusion under the rug or off the streets or into a jail cell. And he said someone has to take the first step and show a cold heart. And good people are getting plowed over. The people in the streets, more often than not, are good people. I don't even know how you get to this perspective. I don't. Maybe from not speaking to these people, maybe it's distance creates sociopathy. Maybe it's something where you're not as involved in that world and it's easy to create that separation. Those folks, more often than not, are just like you. And the people getting bowled over are the people being ripped out of their homes because something bad happened to them. More often than not, just something went wrong. In America, to get above the poverty line, on average, you need 8 years straight of nothing going wrong. The majority of Americans cannot afford a $400 emergency. Most Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Those are the good people getting bowled over, and they're getting bowled over by the oligarchy that trains people to believe that solving the problem is removing the symptoms. We know in medicine that doesn't work this way. And then he says, could you look in the eye? Could you look him in the eye, a politician, and say things are okay? And I'm not a politician, but I would, and presumably will at some point in the near future, look him in the eye and say things are not okay. But what he was proposing will only create the illusion that it's better as a performance for the dwindling number of people that can pay for it, while actually only making it worse. He's not talking about solutions. He's talking about comforting delusion. And then he goes on to talk about how medical insurance is a scam, and in many ways it is. And he's talking about, well, how do we deal with that? Because you're getting these claims denied, but you're paying into it. The purpose of insurance as a company in a capitalist system is to charge premiums and deny your claim. That's how they stay in business, by denying claims. It's a scam. Yes, 100% agree. It is a scam. And so is the rest of society. And we need to confront that head on and get very sober about the nature of this problem and try to figure out some way to deal with it. Not with a cold heart, but with compassion. And for people of faith, that compassion that Jesus tried to encourage his followers to have, that's what we need. Not a cold heart. Here's an example, okay? Just an example. What happens when you join the legions of people who develop a sickness? Maybe it's from the job that you worked at that didn't bother to do what was necessary to keep you safe and healthy because it wasn't profitable to do so. And you have a home. You worked at that job that didn't care about you, that made you sick, so you could get a scrap of what's left of the American dream. And you've got your home. But you're sick now, and you lose that job because you're in the hospital. And then insurance denies your claim, and you become yet another American who enters medical bankruptcy, the number one country in the world for medical bankruptcy. And you know what? Now you can't make your mortgage payment. What happens then? Bank takes your house. You're homeless. And you know what the bank does with that house? Oh, they make it into a rental property so they could diversify their portfolio. And they're charging more for rent than your mortgage costs. Guess what? Quite often, rent costs more than a mortgage. Just enjoy that little piece of class warfare. So now you gather what you can carry and try to find a place to hide, a place to be. You find community with a bunch of people who also fell through the cracks of this system, and those cracks were left open because it wasn't profitable to fill them. Or more cynically, those cracks were left open because the people, the working class, need a threat. They need to see what happens to people who slip up. They need to see that poverty and know, oh God, that could be me. If I don't work really hard and scrimp every penny and keep running in this rat race, I could be that. That could be me. Conversely, it could be part of the army of surplus labor, groups of people that will always be desperate, always be more desperate than you, always willing to work for less and keeping prices down. You see how this all goes to benefit the people at the top? This is evil. Again, evil. And it's capitalism. They're one and the same. Ugh. But you don't have a house anymore. And you find a bunch of people and start to realize, wow, all these homeless folks that I was taught to believe are just a bunch of drug addicts and degenerates, a lot of them are just people. Oh my God, a lot of them are still working. And you try to get a job. You want to try to rebuild your life. You don't want to become like these people all around you that, they're all dirty and they're sad and some of them are missing teeth. Some of them have addictions. Oh, you're not going to be like them. You're not going to do it. So you try to get a job, but you don't have an address. Most jobs, they require addresses to apply to. They're not going to hire a homeless person. They're not going to hire a bum. So you go work under the table somewhere because it's the only place that'll afford you. And those people, they know that you are desperate. Remember how I mentioned that earlier? They know that you're desperate and will work for anything to try to get a foot up, to try to get off the streets. And when you get to the end of the day, they give you a couple of sandwiches and say, get out. And they say you should be grateful to be off the streets for a few hours. You should be grateful to have this food. And you can't do anything. You're an illegal hire. You come and say, oh, I work for these people illegally. Now you're exposing yourself to some more problems. You see how this can work? And guess what? You get back to your tent. And the next morning, the police are there. And they say, your encampment is being swept. It has been ruled a public health hazard. And so you grab whatever you can, again. And this is, if you're lucky, this is if you're actually home when the sweep happens. A lot of people just lose everything. Everything. Like that woman in New London. And so they come to sweep the encampment. You've already lost everything, and your tent and everything that you couldn't carry are thrown into the trash. Oh, and by the way, you're sick again because you've been sleeping rough and you've been living outside. You haven't been eating all that well. And suddenly, you're a little less confused by the guy next to you who finds the only affordable relief that he can at the local liquor store. People talk about the free market solving this. The free market caused this to begin with. The free market is a lie. It is a machine to create and maintain an oligarchy. people, especially conservatives, rack their brains trying to figure out how do we resolve all these social problems, because we know government's not the issue. And as an anarchist, I'm very sympathetic to that. But I do think collaboration, society, human organization is not necessarily a government as such, and you can organize to solve your problems as a community. But when you just shirk it off onto the free market, it won't solve the problem. It is the problem. It created the problem. The free market is having a mega corporation that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and gets to the point where its wealth is snowballing and it becomes a monopoly. By the rules of the free market, it became a monopoly. Once it gets so big, it becomes functionally unassailable. It becomes an institution. It becomes a government in and of itself and can dictate the circumstances of your life. They don't want a nation of owners. They want a nation of renters. The free market is a lot of different corporations saying, we're going to buy up all this housing because it's legal for us to do that. And if we were to have our freedom to buy these houses limited, that would be an infringement upon us. That would be un-American. That would be communist. That would be evil regulation. And they brainwash well-meaning conservatives into thinking that's a threat to the average conservative, when it's the corporations that are the threat to that conservative. Look at the number of houses that have been purchased by mega corporations in the past few years. It's enormous. They're killing the American dream with the free market, because the inevitable result of capitalism is monopolies. That's what it does. It creates wealth. It creates private empires to control the world. That's what it's doing. You have to know your enemy in order to have a chance, even a prayer, at trying to stop this. And the reason that many conservatives cannot come up with a solution is because they're indoctrinated into the religion of the free market. Or, as we call it, capitalism. They're trained to believe it's raised more people out of poverty, when in many cases, it creates poverty. It creates wealth gaps. And in many cases, especially if you talk about the undeveloped world, it invades a place, imposes the concept of poverty and property, because before you just lived there, you didn't really have a need for a monetary system that we would generally recognize as such. So yeah, you were poor by capitalist standards, but you had all your needs met. You had a land base that could provide for you. You had a home that you've owned for 10 generations. Capitalism comes along and says, no, that's private property now. You have to pay taxes. You have to pay rent. You have to pay utilities. You have to pay all of these things. Oh, and because capitalism likes to pollute the land base, yeah, you can't live off the land anymore, even if you do have access to it. So you have to buy food imported from somewhere else. Well, you can do that by giving us your land. You can do that by working in our factories to get money. It's a scam. Capitalism is your greatest enemy, and most of you are too indoctrinated to even realize it. Anyway, this was quite an angry rant for me. I don't usually sound this angry, and I don't mean any sort of disrespect or any sort of negativity toward the people that I'm referencing right now, because I on the whole, we share a lot, we agree a lot, but when I see what looks like a gap, maybe an understanding, or what seems to me to be poor analysis, I'm going to call it out, because I think that's important to heightening this conversation, because I happen to know both of these people do care about solving the problem. But the indoctrination is so deep and so severe that they can't see the blatantly obvious root cause of the problem. And it's with this that I'm going to be announcing a side project that I'll be posting every once in a while to this podcast. And it's called Voices from the Surplus Army. And that's an old term, and I kind of touched on it conceptually earlier on here, where you have this surplus army of labor. You have this huge group of desperate people often poor, homeless, precarious in some way, whatever, that are always willing to work for less because they're always more desperate for you. Capitalism is a race to the bottom, and the people at the bottom can tell you because they know. But the people at the bottom don't have access to media. The people at the bottom don't have the ability to speak and get their voices out there because that's, again, how this system is structured. The system trains you to believe that these people are all there by their own doing and that they deserve it and that you're nothing like them. It draws a line between you and these people. Spend a little time with them and you'll see that's not the case. You'll find all walks of life amongst people without homes. College-educated people, professionals, people still working and homeless. Many of you just have no idea. And I aim to do my part to humanize these people you just step over in the streets. Thank you for indulging my rant, and I hope to hear from some of you what you think. If you think I'm off base, if you think you agree. And if you're ever interested in making tiny houses for the homeless, I'm happy to give you some information on that. We published plans on how to build our various models, and we happily share them with anyone that's willing to help people in need. Don't be fooled. Never give up. Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast episode. This project is done on a DIY basis on extremely antiquated equipment. And if this is something you'd like to hear more of, and maybe you're feeling particularly generous, you can head on over to patreon.com/Autonomia. That's patreon.com/AFTONOMIA. I'm still looking to figure out what kind of benefits I can offer to any of my subscribers other than my undying gratitude. But if you feel like supporting the show, it would be very helpful. I am a father of 2, husband of 1, trying to provide for my family and do whatever I can to make this world a place I don't have to apologize to those children for. I'd really appreciate any support that happens. Obviously, if you can't, I totally get it. I know how it feels to be up against the wall financially. So thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.